Welcome. This is Spiritual Formation, an invitation to drawing near. I am your host, Kyle Strobel, and this is our first episode. We're calling this episode simply Prelude, Why Now? And that is, I suppose, the question, why now are we doing this? And it's an important question because I think in many ways we are at a kind of key moment in this discussion, and I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about a little bit why I think this is important to do, why I'm taking this on right now, as well as a little bit about who I am and why I think this is something I should be doing. And in many ways, to do that well, I think I need to tell you a little bit of my own story. And this is a little bit getting to why I call this Prelude, because this will feel different than other episodes, but I think it's important to state some of this stuff up front. And so my own story in many ways is an odd one. You know, I grew up the son of Lee Strobel. And so for those of you who know my father, and that means I grew up in Willow Creek's kind of purview. I was, at the heart of the seeker-sensitive movement. I was, in the 80s and 90s, I was a part of Willow when things were exploding and everything was big and exciting. And because my family all became Christians there, I mean, in many ways, we owe that place a lot. That actually creates even some weirder tensions for me. But we did find the Lord there, and we were blessed in so many ways because they met us where we were and where we where our questions were, where our struggles were, and growing up in that place in the 80s and 90s when that's the only church you've ever known is a peculiar experience. Some of it, a lot of people couldn't fathom. I never saw a hymnal until I was in college, and I didn't know how hymns worked. I was shocked when everyone jumped down a stanza after the first line. I thought I'd been left behind or something. And so it's a weird thing to grow up in a church that really has no connection to the tradition, that kind of threw everything out the window and started over. And at no point, at least it seems to me looking back, at no point did anyone ask the question, what would it be like if our plan works? Because the plan was, well, what if we reach people who are unreached? That's a good, that's a great vision. What if we reach folks the church isn't usually reaching? And my father was one of those folks. My mother was one of those people. They didn't know the Lord. They came to the Lord. Willow was their first church, really, in a lot of ways. And then I grew up there, but no one really asked the question, well, what if our plan works and someone grows up here? Like, the seekers become Christians and then they raise a child in this place. And so in many ways, what ended up happening, I was, in many ways, Christianity was in my bones. I thought we'd been Christians for generations, growing up, like a lot of people that grow up in the church. For me, it was kind of normal. And then I realized as I was in high school going to college that I really wasn't given a foundation in anything. I was kind of told, you need to keep coming here, you need to get involved, and you need to bring people. And so what was fueling my early Christian life was excitement. And it was, let's just keep pumping up that excitement. Let's keep on, if you're not excited, get excited, and yet I didn't have anything to hold that up, right? I didn't understand scripture. My prayer life, if I could even call it that, was kind of non-existent. And when I tried to pray, it was just a very confusing place. And eventually I left there angry, as a lot of us leave the church, our youth, really in many ways, in some ways for good reason, in some ways out of just immaturity. But I left and I went to Bible college, and that was a profound season. I grew in knowledge, and yet I had incredible amounts of vice. I had lived a very chaotic life. I was kind of tossed by the waves in so many different ways, but I was turning to a life of the mind to kind of find a foundation. And now, of course, in my mind, I thought I was just grabbing onto Jesus. And some of that was true, no doubt. But a lot of it, I just thought, maybe if I just know enough, maybe I could just kind of shout the truth into my soul, and I will know the depth I've been longing for. And, in high school and into college, one of the great gifts of being a part of Willow actually was John Ortberg. John Ortberg, after my own family, became a kind of in many ways a kind of second father to me. And John was the pastor I'd go to for questions, and he started handing me things. He started to say, "Hey, why don't you spend some time, devotionally reading this?" And it was really through him in those early years that I became kind of interested in the question of spiritual formation. I never really knew, how do I make sense of my calling? How do I make sense of what it means to be like Jesus? How do I make sense of the fact that I can't just simply generate the Christian life? I'm not called to just kind of create a life, and yet do I just wait around? Is it passive? And then there's all these spiritual practices. Well, do I just do all of these? Or are these the equivalent of going to the gym? And if I just kind of go to the gym enough, I'll become strong. And so if I just, fast and read my Bible and pray enough in the right sorts of ways, will I just automatically grow? Like I didn't really understand, but John was really the first kind of introduction into that space. And really in many ways, it was the first time when I felt gripped in my core by what has become my life calling, I think. It was the first time when I began to wrestle with, I love the life of the mind, but I'm not an academic at the end of the day. Like at the end of the day, even though I do that work, I am a professor of theology. I have a PhD in theology. Like I do those things, but I'm never driven simply by the academic question. For me, every academic question is already tied into a kind of existential one. What does it mean to draw near to Jesus? What does it mean to be like him? And so through college, I was doing a Bible degree. And, in many ways, like I said, I grew in knowledge. But as I grew in knowledge, I decreasingly prayed. I decreasingly had a kind of deep emotional experience with the Lord. And it was a weird experience because people were treating me like I was wise, and yet I kind of knew myself. I kind of knew what was in my soul. I knew my temptations. I knew my grandiosity. Although looking back, I didn't know nearly the level of grandiosity I had. And so I was wrestling with what to do with my life. And I thought, well, maybe I am an academic. I began to wonder, I wondered about pastoring, but there was always some character flaws I felt in myself, and I kind of knew in myself that troubled me. I'd seen a lot of toxic things in the church. I'd seen a lot of failures. I'd seen a lot of sin, quite honestly, warp the souls of leaders, and I knew my own sin well enough to be afraid of that. And actually, years later, I was sitting at a coffee shop with J.I. Packer, and I remember Packer told me, he said the same thing. He said, early in my career, I wondered, should I be a pastor? And then he named some kind of character flaws, and a lot of it had to do with his inability to relate to others in certain sorts of ways. And I kind of felt that in myself. I didn't quite know what to call that. Like, what is it in me and that struggles with kind of being with others in certain sorts of ways? And I'll certainly say more about this later. This has become in many ways later in my life a real driving factor to my writing, to my ministry. Right now I'm wrestling through, not only in the Bible but in the theological tradition, how do we think about love, and what is going on when we struggle to love? And that obviously is at the core of the Christian faith, but I didn't really have anyone to walk me into that question. And to be honest, I probably wasn't even able to ask the question myself. I wouldn't have known that was the right question. But in the midst of all of this, as I'm struggling with what to do, and I decided to go to seminary. I didn't know quite what the way forward was going to be. I didn't know if I had it in me to do academic work, and I was not a good student in high school. So it was only in college that I began to kind of grab onto a more serious Christian vision of life and knowledge, but also even just academic vision at all. And so I ended up coming to the Talbot School of Theology, where I am now a professor. And again, this was a really rich experience, but it was one that was surprising in many ways, because at Talbot, I came to Talbot to do philosophy because I wanted to love God with all my mind. Right? I had read J.P. Moreland's book, and J.P. became a mentor of mine. And one of the things that was surprising about coming to Talbot, I kind of thought I was going to come to seminary and I was going to learn a lot. And I wouldn't have said this out loud. I probably wouldn't have known this about myself, but I just kind of wanted to be right. And I wanted to prove to other people I'm right. And I wanted to kind of, show others how much I knew. And so I came to seminary to study philosophy, and yet in a way that I've come to see is just a very Talbot emphasis. None of my professors were all that. Well, none of them were interested in my grandiosity. I can tell you that right now. But they were also not entirely interested in academics for academic's sake. They said, "Yeah, sure, this is a great vision. You should do academic work if that's your calling." But they'd be quick to remind me, "But that isn't the only calling, and it's not like that's the most significant calling." But then they would also ask me questions about my spiritual life, like, "What is your life with the Lord actually like?" And it's interesting when you're sitting in metaphysics class. That's not the question you expect to be asked, and yet part of what has kind of saturated Talbot's identity is what I think of as one of the original visions of evangelicalism, and that is a kind of Bible-centered, spirit-empowered whole life spirituality. And it isn't enough just to kind of learn the Bible well. It's like, yeah, you could do that in the flesh. It isn't enough to simply try to get the right answers. No, you could do that in the flesh. And so I was confronted with a lot when I came here. And I'd come to discover that at the end of the day, there were other questions. I wasn't driven by the philosophical questions, but it was really here through J.P. Moreland and others, as well as earlier with John Ortberg, that I was introduced to Dallas Willard. And, J.P. Moreland and several other of our faculty had been mentored by Dallas Willard and done their PhDs under Dallas Willard. And Dallas Willard is a philosopher who wrote in Spiritual Formation. And I kind of realized these are the questions I long to ask. And I just didn't know there was a place you could do that. And so I struggled for a little while. I actually, probably one of the lowest points of my life came in the next year. I graduated and then had a year where I just kind of floated, didn't know what to give myself to, didn't know what to do. And I was despairing in a lot of ways. I mean, I had really struggled with assurance of my faith, assurance of my salvation, and that kind of came to a head in a lot of ways in that year. And I came to a place of despairing, wondering, Lord, are you with me or not? Really? Are you, have I actually had faith in you? And that was a profound time. The Lord really met me in incredible ways in that season. I remember coming to a place where I was alone and I prayed, Lord, maybe I'm not saved, and maybe that's okay because you are God and I am not. And regardless, I want to follow you because that's the only place to have life. That's the only life there is. You are my only hope. And I realized, I think, for the first time of how much I had been following Jesus to get something from him that was not simply him. It's not wrong to want things from the Lord. The Lord offers many promises. The Lord offers good things. And yet he offers those by giving us himself first and foremost. And so that was a year where I really discovered how much of my Christian life was actually even being lived in the flesh. One of the standard lines of evangelical spirituality has always been ours is a spirituality of filthy rags. Like, we remember that our good works are even those are filthy rags before the cross. And so I had come to think of my good works as kind of pre-sanctified and purified, and if I was, doing a Bible study, or if I was singing to the Lord and was filled with joy, like those were somehow perfected things. And it was my mind wandering in prayer that was imperfect or something like that. And the Lord really showed me, like, no, in both of those, there's actually a lot of weeds and a lot of wheat. There's a lot of stuff in this. And so that was a profound season. And again, wrestling with what I wanted to do, I came back to Talbot. I ended up doing a New Testament degree, studying under folks who had done a lot on kind of spiritual formation in the New Testament. I had been impacted by a lot of folks who were arguing for some of the visions of what it means to be a disciple. I'll talk about that later in this podcast because I've come to see that very differently now. But I dove into the New Testament, and again, it reminded me of my early years in Bible college, where I just fell in love with Scripture all over again, and just really wanted to give myself to that. And then it was from there that I started at our Institute for Spiritual Formation, and this was a brand new thing. And it was funny because I didn't even know you could do this. I was jumping around in all these disciplines, the Bible, I was doing philosophy, I toyed around with theology and stuff, and apologetics a bit. And then suddenly I was sitting in spiritual formation courses And it's funny looking back now because I get to teach these courses, and all of our students get to take these courses where you sit there and I was just realizing, like, these are the questions I have. This is what I want to wrestle with. What is the Christian life like? Or what does it mean to sow in the spirit versus sowing in the flesh? Or how do I live according, as James says, according to the way from above, which is the way of Jesus, and not the way from below, which is the way of the world, the flesh, and the devil? Why am I tempted to actually employ the way from below to grow? And so these are all sorts of things. Suddenly I'm sitting in class, we're asking these questions, and I'm like, my goodness, you could do this? This is amazing. This is what I've been called to do. And so from there, I actually went on and I did a PhD in theology, because I realized that in the Christian tradition, when spiritual formation was divorced from theology, it ceased to be distinctively Christian. And when theology was divorced from spirituality, it died. And as I looked across my life, the theology I'd been introduced to in my youth was dead, which is why I hated reading it. It was lifeless. And then I came to realize a lot of spiritual formation I had picked up along the way was kind of unmoored from Christ. And so I wanted to give myself, and this has been really my kind of my vocation, I think, is to kind of wrestle through, how do we recover this original vision? And I know the evangelical word, that's a mixed bag at best, and there's questions with whether even that word is worthwhile holding on to. But the original vision of this Christ-centered, very word-centric in all sorts of ways, spirit-empowered, whole life spirituality. I think that was the right vision, And yes, it's been commandeered in all sorts of ways, and yes, we kind of lost our way, but that's what I wanted to recover. And so I actually went into a PhD in Jonathan Edwards, and really in many ways that has been a kind of angle into what the original vision of evangelicalism was. And so, in terms of this podcast, why now? What is this? Why do I think this is an important thing to be doing? Well, as I look across the kind of spiritual formation movement, it's generally seemed to kind of have started in the 70s. Often folks point to Richard Foster's book, and you have Richard Foster and Dallas Willard and folks with the rise of Renovare. Even around the same time, but totally unconnected, you had guys like Donald Blash, who was an evangelical theologian doing work in spiritual formation. Someone like Richard Lovelace, who was so impactful on Tim Keller and his understanding of renewal. And in many ways, Lovelace has a similar vision as I've come to develop, where we need to first and foremost go back to our own tradition and wrestle with what have we actually said about these things. Lovelace coined a term he called the sanctification gap. And when he converted over to Protestantism, actually from Roman Catholicism, he was shocked because of how deep and how rich the spiritual tradition is in evangelicalism. But then he said there's something he called the sanctification gap, which was a gap of knowledge, because every time he talked to pastors and congregants in these churches, none of them had ever even heard of our own spiritual tradition. And so that's what I'm trying to kind of dig back into. And then even someone like John Coe, who you may or may not know. John Coe is my mentor, started the Institute for Spiritual Formation here. He's another one of these figures that he didn't do a lot of writing like the rest of these folks did, although John and I have written together now. But he really focused in institutionally, and he was kind of removed. I mean, he was friends with all these folks, but he was doing something a little different. And so it was off of this initial wave of folks that we then have institutions develop, ministries develop, but then this whole group of popularizers that arose out of this. And in many ways, that's where we're at now. And the problem is, I want to say, actually, what we need is a new wave of a cohesive spiritual vision that is richly theological. And by that, I mean richly kind of grounded in our core beliefs about who Christ is, who God is, how he has revealed himself to us in Christ Jesus, and how he has given us his spirit for life with him. And so again, getting back to that word-centric, spirit-empowered, whole life spirituality, I think the why now question is turning to, because we still really haven't offered that. There is not a lot of theologically rich discussions in spiritual formation. In many ways, one of the great dangers in spiritual formation is that there's a lot of folks that treat the Christian tradition as an arbitrary kind of buffet line of things. as if their other beliefs and their theological beliefs didn't kind of lead them to believe the things they did or lead them into the spiritual practices they gave themselves to. And so whenever we fail to have a conversation theologically, one of the things that happens is that it ceases to be Christian. And I know I'm saying theology, and some of you are going, I still don't know what that means. We will talk about that. That's all right. That's totally understandable and reasonable. But let me give you an image. And the image comes from Fred Sanders' book. It's an image he uses in The Deep Things of God. And it's what he calls a cultures of decadence. And, as Fred narrates it, cultures of decadence are cultures that used to have like all pistons firing. Everyone knew this is what we're about. You think of the kind of pilgrims coming over to the colonies, and they kind of knew what the vision was. They knew what they were leaving behind and why. They knew what was missing. They knew what they wanted life to be. And everyone kind of understood that. But then what inevitably happens is generation later, or 2 or 3 generations later, you have a bunch of forms and you have a bunch of teaching, but people have lost the cohesive vision. People don't know, well, what is this about? And Fred tells us that inevitably what ends up happening is 2 groups emerge. A group that leans conservative, and they come to think less is safer. And so we need to reduce these down to the kind of core principles. And, then we need to, in many ways protect those, even though we're not even sure why we hold them necessarily. This is just what we do. We kind of hold these and protect them. But then another group comes, which is a little more liberal in its inclination, and they kind of think, well, look, new's better, and we don't know what these things are for anyway, so we should just get rid of them. But we need to see that both of these are failures. The goal isn't to kind of protect or get rid of. The goal is, well, what is the vision? Like, how do these cohere in Christ by the Spirit for true life, for flourishing? And so this is what I hope this podcast will be. I don't want it to be lengthy. I don't want it to be too academic. I will have some longer form things every now and again. I hope this is an invitation that you can receive to draw near. And I hope you can hear is that. Let me invite you to draw near to your Lord. And even as I narrate my own history very briefly, think about your own story. Like, where's the Lord taken you? What are some things that have been deeply impactful for you? As I even look at now in my own life, how much failure I've seen in ministry, how much I've seen toxic power warp the church and warp ministries and warp the souls of its leaders, how much I've seen kind of quests to have all the right answers lead to withered hearts. How, those things in many ways have shaped why I give myself to what I do. And so consider your own life with the Lord. And let me offer one more invitation with this. We live in a day where podcasts abound and information abounds, and it is so easy to hear some interesting things and to think, wow, fascinating, and then move on with your life. Maybe at best you have a conversation with someone else about it. Instead of that, or I should say on top of that, please do have conversations with others about this. But more importantly, talk to the Lord about this. I hope that anytime you listen to this, that your first move is to draw near to your Lord and to open your heart to the truth. Seek him. If you have worries about something I said, offer those to the Lord. Lord, why am I worried about this? Is this true? How do I think about this? Where else does your word talk this way, or does your word talk this way? Draw near to your Lord, because the whole movement of the Christian life is one of drawing near. Boldly ascend to the throne of grace. That is our hope, because that is where life is found. Thank you so much for being here with me. I hope that this will be meaningful, and I hope that we can continue to wrestle together with what is this life of drawing near. Bless you, and I look forward to sharing this journey with you in the future.